Welcome back, Brad Nelson. Another tutorial in Flexsim. This time I want to cover warehousing so that I can talk about floor storage and racking systems. They're a little bit different. They add some extra functionality, which is really quite nice, but they're a little bit complicated, so I thought this needed a dedicated video. To make it a little bit simpler to understand, I've created kind of a floor plan. I just use PowerPoint. You can use Visio. It's a little bit better. It's a single slide. I selected all the items, save as picture, and saved it as a PNG. It's a little bit weird to find where to load a floor plan, so I'll just show you now. If you click on the toolbox, what you'll need to do to begin with is hit this plus key, come down to visual at the bottom, and there's model floor and model background. Model floor defines the color and texture of the floor itself. That's not what we want. We want to click on model background. There's a file path. So I pointed to the PNG. This could be also a JPEG. Flexsim recommends a DWG file, which you can create in Visio if you store it as an AutoCAD format. It will load your image as kind of a underlying image to your model, which is really nice for organizing things. You can now use these adjustments here to shift it around and move it in the XYZ direction, and also to scale it. So you can stretch it or shrink it to sort of fit your model. So let's get to the model itself. I have a supplier who generates these materials, like who puts boxes on pallets and sends the pallets to us. Then I have a receiving area with a floor storage, and then I'm using an AGV to deliver the pallets to the right rack. The pallets then get unloaded by an operator and put into the proper storage location. Putting boxes on pallets, I need a combiner. I'll come back to my library here. So I'm using a combiner function. That's what this is. And a combiner needs to have two inputs, the container and the thing that's going into the container. In my case, the container is a pallet. The thing to note about these combiners is once you connected two things on your on the input ports, like the A connect, right, from the source 1 and source 2, the first source always needs to be the container, in my case the pallet. If you have them in the wrong order, you can click one and use these up and down arrows to shift them. You don't have to disconnect and reconnect. You can actually have multiple products. You could pack 5 things onto a pallet and so on. You can have multiple sources. You'll get this component list, and it'll ask you, so how many of those things will go into this container? So I've arbitrarily just set up a capacity of 12. I've said I want 12 boxes per pallet, and I left it as a constant. You can get fancier. Frankly, I don't know how. It takes probably a little bit of coding to have this number be more flexible. So I got a pallet source that will just, and the flow item class is a pallet. This is just a selection from the pull down. I pick the pallet. Instead of the inter-arrival time, I want it to generate a whole bunch of pallets right away that are available to use. So if I choose the arrival schedule instead of inter-arrival time, then I get this table shows up. Now, edit the table. The default is one arrival with no labels, and that works just fine for me. The arrival time is 0. So immediately when I click run, that's time 0, and I want to deliver 100 pallets right away. So when I reset and run, boom, there's 100 pallets. Okay, that's perfect. Similarly with a product, I don't want a product, a box showing up every minute. This represents the supplier, which is sort of outside of my model, and I want them to have product ready to go, put in a pallet, and get it into my factory so that it's there when my shift shows up and shift starts. So I want all this supplier side stuff to happen basically at time 0. So I've done the same thing. I'm just going to ship a box. I'm happy with that. With the arrival schedule, again, Now my table is a little bit more complicated because I want to deliver different kinds of product. For example, I've had one student talk to me and say, I have dairy, frozen, and sort of dry goods or general product. I've set up more than one arrival, and you can see here, the first arrival is at time 0, and I got 120 pieces of type 1. Then I also have 120 pieces of, 120 pieces of type 2 and some more of type 3. So I've defined 3 types. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I've also, just as a demonstration, I've created these subtypes. So for example, frozen, you can have frozen vegetables, frozen pizza, frozen dinners, frozen meat, frozen whatever, parathas and pierogies and other kind of cool stuff, right? So you can have a whole bunch of things that fit each type of product. And I recommend just using numbers. It'd be nice if we put in dairy and frozen and meats and pizza and all these sorts of things. But I think it's easier if we deal with numbers. Notice that all my quantities are divisible by 12. That's intentional because I've set the pallet capacity of 12. It'll always fill a pallet, and that pallet will contain one type. I'm going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 720 boxes of various types and subtypes will be generated at time 0. That to me represents a truckload. And then I've said 120 minutes later, my model default is minutes, so 120 minutes later, I will have another truckload. And I've just set up a little bit more of a quantity variety. Again, everything's divided by 12. All right. That's my supplier then. If I reset, my model's running nice and slowly here, and run, you'll see the pallets all get generated right away, and product 12 at a time put onto pallets and combined or palletized. 0 setup time and a very quick processing time. I didn't set it to 0 so that you could see it. You could set it to 0, but then you wouldn't see anything happen. It would just be instantaneous. And send to port, first available. Don't need transport because the material I want it to show up in my storage location. If I used a queue instead of floor storage, things would just, and I could stretch the queue to make it big enough, physically big enough to accommodate all these different pallets. The pallets would all come in, start at one corner, and the queue would fill. And if that's the way your warehouse works, great. I wanted to do this a little bit fancier, so as the product is received, it is put into a designated storage space. So I've selected the floor storage, dragged it in. Over in the storage object, you can see you've got this option to edit dimensions. And this lets me define the shape and size of my floor storage. Knowing that I have 3 different types, frozen, dairy, and general, I've said I want 3 bays, but I need a fair bit of storage to hold a whole truckload, so I've set 12 levels. And in course of a rack, levels are vertical, and floor storage levels are horizontal. And then I've set up 2 slots per bay, okay? And I intentionally defined the bay widths to be large enough to accommodate 2 skids. A skid in Flexsim, or a pallet, is 1.25 meters. So you can see though that the bays are these long strips, each bay with 12 levels in it. And that gets me the shape that I have here. So how does it know where to put the product? The default is random bay level and slot. Let me just show you what would happen. If I reset and run my model. Well, okay, so random is interesting and chaotic. Hopefully your warehouse doesn't look like that. Instead of first slot with space, I've said matching labels. And if you remember, I defined item types on the source for the product. I added those two labels. The first label with type, with an uppercase T. It's case sensitive, so you have to remember whether you're doing uppercase or not. So type, and I've defined 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then I define another label, subtype, which I'm not using just yet. This is the default here. Slot type equals item type. Reset and run my model. I get this weird kind of a condition where everything gets stuck on the same spot. The logic isn't working. Took me a little bit to figure out. The item in this case is the pallet full of product. Let me come in and I'll just zoom in and let's show you the issue here. This is a pallet full of product. And I've clicked on it. And if I come over here to expose the labels, there aren't any labels. But if I pick a box on the pallet, under labels, you can see if this is a type 3, subtype 302. So why isn't the storage space putting in this right place? Because the pallet isn't labeled, the product is labeled. So I need to find a way to have the storage item look at the container or the box type. And the solution is easy once you find it. So thank you to the Flexsim forum for showing this to me. But I need to say it's the item first type. The idea is now it's looking at the first piece that was packed onto the pallet. This is kind of the magic secret to figuring out how to identify the product on the pallet instead of the pallet. Reset and run my model. I should now be applying this logic. Here, we'll just stop and confirm. This is a type 1. This is type 2. And these guys are all type 3. Great. Now, how did I identify the slot types? This is another sort of weird thing. Again, it's easy to use. You have to click on your storage. This works for floor storage and for racks. Come on. Okay, so I've activated I've clicked on or selected my floor storage. Then come down and click on Paint Slot Labels. Now, I've already painted mine, so the colors show up here. When you first do it, this will be blank. And in fact, maybe what I could do here is just bring in a new floor storage just to show you. Yeah, I'll just shove it out of the way here. Okay, paint slot labels. Now I get this storage slot label painter. And you have some options. The default is paint individual slots. And you'll see there's a number here, value 1. I can come in and now paint individual slots as type 1. This type is the default, and for me that works. I'm taking advantage of that. I'm using it. You can rename this or change the label that you're using. And this is why I say using numbers is better, because these rack systems use values, not strings. But I don't want to go in and paint individual slots. I would like to paint all the slots in the same bay. So if I click on a corner here, that whole bay gets painted this color. And more importantly, get assigned this value or the type gets assigned this value. And if I want to now paint item 2, I clicked on the number 2 and then I hit the tab key for it to read. And now I'm going to make those number 2s. Maybe I need more space for number 2s, and I could make this number 3 and set those up as type 3 storage locations. Now, when I hit escape, I wish the colors would stay there, but they don't. But they're there, right? It's more for while you're painting them so that you can see. There's a way of having the colors stay. I'll show you that in a bit when we get over to the racks. Okay, I'm going to delete this guy. I'm not using it. But this is what I've done here. If I click on paint slate labels, you can see I've painted each bay and identified type 1, type 2, and type 3 storage locations. And you can see that's the logic that the storage location used when it stored the product. And a way to think of this is you kind of either have the sending, like the source of the material when it's sending material, either it decides where to send it, or in cases of floor storage and racks, you can have them decide where to put it. And in this case, right, it kind of makes sense that the supplier doesn't say where things go, the receiver does. It says, oh, that's dairy, put it over there. That's frozen, put it over there, right? And so this kind of makes more sense to me. The separator just says output. I'll come over here and point. Output, send to port, first available. Just one thing connected, just go to storage and they will tell you where to go. And right, and then my storage has this logic that says as a storage object, slot assignment strategy, so it'll assign the space according to the label. The other thing, this should be clicked by default. Use under flow, use as a fixed resource. I've left the maximum content as being nearly infinite. Okay, and on the input side, I'm leaving pull unchecked because the supplier pushes material to the storage. So I don't need to have the storage pull material off the truck. The truck is unloaded into storage. So it's not a pull type, which is by default. All right, I hope you're still with me. So that gets my product, my pallets of product in the right place inside my building. I've now set up, now it needs to be shelved. I've kind of arbitrarily, well, not arbitrarily, I've set up 3 different racks, and the idea is that each rack, that there's one rack per product type. I could have multiple racks. I could have several racks here, but I've just chosen to make this easy and have one rack that would receive each different product type. Now this is where I have set the logic. Well, like you can come back and see I've got my output port connections going to all 3 of these. Let's see. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. Storage object. So now we're talking about the output ports. I know this is going to be a little bit long, but bear with me. All right. Clicking on my floor storage and coming down here to see my output ports, you can see I've got Q1, Q2, and Q3. So I've got these kind of a holding spot for the product placer in front of each rack, so that the pallets can be brought out to the racks. But I have to figure out which rack to send it to. And I'm doing that I'm making that decision at the storage area. When they pick up the material, they need to know where to go. I've got these 3 output ports set up, and so for the output of my floor storage, the default would be first available. And if I set that up, all the product would go to Q1 for rack 1. That's not what we want. We want them to go to the right place. So here's the other way that you can use these labels. I've set up, instead of first available, I'm choosing port by case. In other words, I'm going to decide which port to send product to, which queue, based on a specific case, or case by case basis. Here's the logic I've done. I'm looking at this would normally be set up as item type. And remember, if this was just boxes, that would be great, but it's boxes on pallets. So I need to look at the item first type to kind of get past the pallet and look at the box itself. There'll always be this default port. I've left it alone at 1, and then I've hit the plus button 3 times here to get 3 different cases, because I get this first type could be a 1 or a 2 or a 3. So I need a condition. I need a result for each. If it's 1, I want to go to port 1. If in case the type is 2, send it to port 2. And if the case is that the type is 3, send it to port 3. This one, right? That gets the material delivered to the right place. My type 1 stuff comes here. I'll speed this up a little bit. My type 2 stuff gets here, and my type 3 stuff goes here. Okay. Thank you, Mr. AGV driver, for demonstrating. Okay, so I got these queues out on the Walmart floor, in front of each rack, ready to be unloaded. One of the things I'll show you now, it's one of the last sort of things that I figured out, but this is a good place to show you. These queues, I don't want the queue to stack up to the ceiling, and I also don't want this AGV would naturally unload FIFO. The first material comes in, gets delivered, and what would happen then? Here, maybe I can just demonstrate. This queue, I think the default is like a capacity of 1,000 or something like that. And watch what happens. The AGV delivers the first product, then the second product, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and so on. And the poor associate who has to unload onto rack 1 gets blasted and buried, and the people working on the second and third rack are probably laughing right now because they don't have anything to do. The solution is really simple, and I kind of already showed you there. Reset. Set the queue content, max content, to be just 1. And that way, I'm going to hit the tab key to get out of that. And that way, when I reset and run my model, the AGV will, if there's already a pallet there, will move to the next one. And if there's a pallet there, it'll move to the next one. And if there's a pallet on all 3, the AGV is now free to go off and do other jobs. And you could set it to 1 or 2 or whatever is appropriate, right? But this keeps all 3 rack placers busy. Okay. So let me zoom in and look at what's going on here with this rack. Maybe I'll speed this up a little bit. You'll notice then all of the type 1 products go to rack 1. But remember, I set up a subtype. I just want to wait until get some subtype material showing up. My subtype 2 goes in a different part of the rack. You can probably predict. I've done the same kind of an idea that I did with the floor storage, where, but now instead of painting the rack, if I'll just come over here and you can see, I'm going to click on paint slot labels, and now you can see the colors that I painted. But in this case, I painted subtypes. So I changed this label. Is by default, if I open up the painter, the default is type. I changed this to the name of what I want to designate for these racks. And this is actually painted then 101. I changed this number to 101. And I changed this. I changed my painter to 102. Painted these 3. And while I was at it, you don't even have to select the rack, the other racks. I changed it to 201 and painted these. 202, painted these. 301, 302 to paint my 3rd rack. Because I already know that it's all type 1 product that's coming here. So now I'm just putting it on the shelf according to the subtype. The queue gets the pallet full of parts. And now instead of using a combiner to put product on the pallet, I'm using a separator. And the separator has these 2 modes, unpack or split. So the splitting is like a cutting operation where it subdivides the thing, but I'm using it as an unpack to remove the product from the pallet. I've said remove the entire contents. I want the whole pallet to be emptied. And I know that sometimes, and you can set it up where there has to be room and so on. And that's a complication that I'm not prepared to get into. I'm just assuming that we're going to unpack the whole pallet. Right. And what else? I've said it takes a minute to unpack. There's no setup time involved. Because it's the time of the unpacking operation is actually how long it takes the person to walk over to the appropriate slot, put the material in, and come back and retrieve it. So it's not the unpacking operation at the pallet that takes time, it's the delivery operation. So I've just got that as a very quick kind of a thing. The output, I've just got send to port, default separator option. And the default separator option is the container goes to port 1 and the contents go to port 2, which is the same in reverse as the palletizer or the the combiner, right? The container is the port 1 and the product is the second port. So I've made sure on my output ports, I've made sure that the first port is connected to the queue where the return pallets are going to go, and then the rack is connected as my second port. The separator as a fixed resource, as a machine here, or thing here, staging area here, that's not the thing that decides where stuff goes. It's the rack that now makes the decision because it can. I could as an alternate, I could have different queues. I could have a queue for each type, and then I would need to make the decision here to send that it each be connected to their own port. And I could output by case, but in this model, I've got a smart rack that has designated spaces that can control where things go. So now I'm clicking on the rack. I hope this is making sense to you guys. I'm doing the same kind of slot assignment strategy that I did for the floor storage. Matching labels. And now here, I've got this subtype that I painted. And the item has a subtype that was assigned back at the supplier. And now I'm finally using it. Notice I don't need to do the item first, item dot first dot subtype, because he's pulling off a box. He's not carrying the pallet and trying to figure out where the pallet goes. He's unloading the pallet, so he's carrying a box, and so the box is the item with the subtype attached to it. And then I've said slot must have space, so they're not all just shoved into the same spot. It will go to the next available one. And the rack takes care of all that logic. I've left pull alone because we're not drawing product into the rack, we're pushing product onto the rack from the separator. I guess the last thing is to talk about using operators. There's a couple different ways of doing it. For the separator, on the output function, delivering material out to the racks, I've clicked on use transport. If you click on use transport, it's the default here, current center objects. So I've shown a couple different ways of doing this. One way is to, instead of leaving the default, you can use the eyedropper here and then click on your operator and select operator. So you can basically name the specific operator that you want. Or you can do a center port connection. Remember that's this, that's this center port connection up here. So if you click on that, and then you can click the separator and the person, and now that person or that operator is attached through the center port to this machine. And that's what I've got in this case. So, and you can see the connection here that's drawn in this red to the center port. Not the arrows, they're squares. It's a way of sort of differentiating. Okay. The squares are the center port connection and the arrows are the A connection. So there's the flow connection and then the center port connection. So this operator is attached quite literally to this machine, and I've said use transport. I think that covers everything that I want to cover in this model. A little bit complicated. I hope I didn't take too long explaining any of that stuff, but try to be clear on it. I hope the tutorial was useful, as all of them. Good luck with your modeling, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks very much.